Few people could have imagined that a nurse with many years of experience working with dying people in places where people spend their last days when medicine is already powerless would make a series of statements that would shock the whole world. She said, "There is an opinion that there are many cynics and atheists among doctors. I've been caring for the dying for over 20 years. It would seem that watching someone else's grief, I also had to become a hopeless cynic and a pessimist. But instead, watching death, I believed in the existence of another life," admits Barbara Karnes. Who is this woman who so unequivocally asserts that a different reality awaits each of us beyond the threshold of death? Barbara was born in 1941 and enrolled in a nursing course right after graduating from high school. After graduating, Barbara first worked as a full-time nurse, then became an administrator and executive director at hospices and home care agencies. She worked there until her retirement. We can say that this woman is a specialist in the care of terminally ill people. All of Barbara Karnes' patients have diagnoses that modern medicine is powerless against. They are living out their last days and weeks with incurable diseases. Observing these people, Barbara Karnes compiled a reference book in which she described the behavior of her patients. A small booklet called "Gone from My Sight: The Dying Experience" was written in 1985. Since then, it has been translated into 12 languages and has a worldwide total circulation of over 45 million copies. In her work, Barbara sympathetically explains the stages of the dying process, living with a life-threatening illness, pain relief, and how people experience grief. She explains how important it is to take care of yourself if you are caring for a patient and offers recommendations for specialists. Now, relatives of patients in hospices in America receive such a book. What is discussed in this handbook inspires faith in life after death. People do not understand that there is a normal, natural way to die. My materials are written to guide and support those who face end-of-life situations. Since 1994, Barbara has been engaged in educational activities. She travels around the country a lot, talking about end-of-life issues and the stages of dying at national and regional medical conferences, and has spoken at colleges, nursing schools, hospitals, and hospices. She is an expert who is relied upon to teach families how to explain the dying process. Barbara has devoted the last 40 years of her life to teaching, caring, and supporting dying people and their loved ones. I can't explain these cases, but I witnessed them, so I believe in it. Death equalizes everyone. Among my patients, there are both ordinary workers and people who have held a high position in society. But when a person dies, their social status loses its significance. Everyone, regardless of their position, is afraid of the unknown. This fear is intensified in cases where the dying person has already witnessed how his loved one left this life hard. However, according to my observations, this fear disappears shortly before death in most of my patients, says Barbara Karnes. A nurse tells about a woman with heart failure. She was very afraid as she saw the severe death of her father from the same disease. We convinced her that death is usually a peaceful process, during which people become more sleepy as their organs slow down. They fall into unconsciousness, but until the last minute, they are able to hear and feel the touch of a friendly hand, even if they can no longer communicate. A few weeks before death, a person often sees and talks with people they know and who died before him. According to Barbara Karnes, this is a very common phenomenon. Thanks to her experience with dying people, she has collected hundreds of such stories. Before they die, patients talk to me not so much about God as about the deceased relatives who have come to them, says the nurse. When patients say that they have seen their mother, their deceased child, or even a pet, it always reassures them. And it becomes clear to the staff that the patient is living out his last hours. These stories left no doubt in the nurse's mind that deceased loved ones come to help a person make the transition from this world to another. The figure that is most often shown to the dying, according to Karnes, is their mother. For example, one of Barbara Karnes' patients was dying of cancer. She was very restless the last night of her life. This woman fell asleep only in the morning. In the presence of Barbara Karnes, she suddenly opened her eyes and looked intently at the part of the room where no one was. The woman smiled tiredly and said, "Mom, I'm so glad to see you." Shortly after this episode, the patient died. One of my patients was not an old woman at the age of 52. She was dying after an operation that didn't help her. This woman was terrified of death, and she often told me that she would fight for her life to the last. 2 days before she left, she kept raising her head, seemed to be looking through me and exchanging short remarks with someone. I asked the patient who she was seeing, and she replied that her dead father was talking to her. Shortly before her death, this woman said, "It's okay, I'm not scared." I can't explain these cases, but I witnessed them, so I believe in it, says Barbara Karnes. In another case, an elderly patient was talking to her mother and brother, who had died earlier. For several days, this woman talked with her invisible guests. After that, she fell asleep with a smile. In the last conversation with her mother, the patient agreed that it was time for her to go home. She left quietly. From the history of near-death vision research, the first attempts to bring together observations of dying patients were made at the beginning of the last century. The founder of this can be considered the Irish physics professor William Barrett. He started collecting information after hearing an interesting story from his own wife, who worked at the Royal Dublin Clinic. Doris, a patient who was dying after a difficult birth, spoke with great joy about seeing her late father. Then, with a rather puzzled expression, she said, "But for some reason, Vita was with him." She died soon after. Doris's sister, Vita, had died a week before the incident. But due to Doris's state of health, her family had not told her about it. Curious about this improbable story, Barrett collected and analyzed reports from nurses and doctors on the subject, which cover over 35,000 cases. The data was collected in the UK, USA, and India. The professor concluded that those who said that their deceased relatives had come for them to take them to the afterlife died sooner and easier than those who simply talked about seeing angels and angel-like creatures in the other world. Sometimes the visions were reported by people who were not going to die, which eliminates the possibility of waiting for the event. One young Indian man who had received a college education was recovering rapidly from his illness. They were going to discharge him that day. Both the doctor and the patient hoped for a full recovery. Suddenly, the patient exclaimed, "There's someone in white clothes standing here. I'm not going with you." He died 10 minutes later. There are 3 common theories about how and why such events occur. The first is the body theory. According to her, such visions are caused by lack of oxygen, release of endorphins and other chemicals. The second is a psychological theory, according to which visions of deceased relatives are a psychological defense of the body from death. The third is a spiritual theory that connects these experiences with the existence of the soul and the afterlife. Whatever theory you follow, near-death visions exist and are included in the Karnes Hospice directory as harbingers of impending death. I'm sure there's more to life than the physical dimension. I know that I walk a fine line when I talk about such things, but they really happen. A few weeks before death, a person loses interest in our world because it is no longer the meaning of his existence. I do not know the details of how the brain and consciousness work, but I believe that they are capable of more than is commonly believed. I'm sure there are scientific explanations for what I've seen so many times, but suffice it to say, I'm convinced that there's more to life than the physical dimension, says Barbara Karnes. Karnes believes that as we approach death, the veil separating our physical reality from another dimension becomes thinner, and the dying person begins to feel as if they are living in 2 worlds at the same time. Perhaps this is why Barbara Karnes' patients see those who are dear to them, who left before them. Barbara Karnes witnessed not only how grown-up children talk and interact with deceased parents, but also how excited elderly parents are when they see their child who died in infancy. In addition to patients seeing deceased relatives, dying people also talk about visions of lights, unknown figures, and places of incredible beauty. As an example, Barbara Karnes cites her elderly patient, who became increasingly weak over the course of several days. But one day she sat up in her bed, looked up, and asked, "Do you see these lights? They want me to follow them." A few minutes later, this woman died. One of my patients was a 90-year-old woman. Many times she told me that she hears the beautiful singing of the choir and feels the touch of wings. When she talked about it, a serene smile appeared on her face. Barbara Karnes cites a case from her practice. Another Karnes patient talked to his deceased parents for several days. One afternoon, he turned to Barbara, who entered his room and said, "I'm going home. It's so beautiful there, with lights and clouds everywhere." On the same day, this man died. Here's another interesting story. A 67-year-old woman saw her deceased husband. He said he would show her the path she needed to follow in order to be able to die peacefully. Another elderly woman was lucid before her death. She told me that angels had gathered by her bed and were ready to take her home. When patients see something like this, it always reassures them. At the same time, I understand that a person is living out his last hours. I believe that the transition of such patients to another world is easy and with minimal fear. There are silent experiences in which the actions of the dying person warn us that death is very close. It can be looking into a corner of the room or holding out your hands as if they are pulling someone closer to hug you. Sometimes they can even silently follow something, looking at the ceiling. Family members of her patients also tell Barbara Karnes about similar visions. They say that their dying relatives don't only see the dead. Quite often they talk about some bright lights. According to Barbara Karnes, bright lights are a hallmark of many near-death experiences. Karnes believes that the lights represent either some kind of higher spiritual being or the afterlife. Dying people often say that they are drawn to the light, which comforts them and amazes them with its beauty. Often, those who are close to the dying person share their near-death visions with them. Such evidence is valuable from an evidentiary point of view. Several people see and feel the same thing. In addition, such incidents defy scientific explanations. For example, the hypothesis that all such visions are provoked by the dying brain, because the accomplice's brain was not in the process of dying. They do not have hypoxia, fear of death, or other symptoms that can affect brain function at the time of death. Here is an example of such a vision. The 5 Anderson siblings in Atlanta were on duty at their dying mother's bedside. Since she was seriously ill for a long time, the children psychologically accepted the inevitable. According to one of the daughters, suddenly there was a bright light in the room. He did not look like any earthly light. I nudged my sister to see if she was seeing the same thing as me, and when I turned to her, I noticed that her eyes were as big as saucers. My brother was sitting with his mouth agape. We all saw the same thing, and we were scared for a while. Then they saw lights that took the form of a portal. Their mother came out of the body and left through this passage. Other shared experiences sometimes include a review of some events in the life of the deceased. Accomplices may see friends and relatives of the dying person whom they did not know before. One of the survivors subsequently looked at the album and recognized the people he had first seen during such a divided vision. One of our biggest fears about death is the fear of dying alone. But hospice workers are confident that we will not go over the edge of life alone. Deathbed visions soothe the dying. This happens frequently all over the world, regardless of the patient's age, gender, nationality, religious beliefs, or income level. In their last moments of life, the dying calm down. The visions that terminally ill people experience in the last minutes of their earthly lives have demonstrated that death is not the lonely and frightening experience that most people believe in. Boundless peace is something we would all like to experience before passing away. Working with the dying, I witnessed how people left when their dead relatives were near them. Still, it's easier for me to see my charges off on their last journey, knowing that someone has come for them. It also strengthens my belief that there is something bigger than our world. At least it gives me hope that when it's time for me to leave, someone I care about will show up to pick me up, says Barbara Karnes. Dear friends, thank you for watching my video to the end. If you liked it, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's very important. Thank you, and have a nice day.